Hey guys, my name's Khadroth, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the upcoming Grand Lancer duel that JP will be having. So I made a video like this for the Berserker one as well, because naturally with this duel approaching, a lot of people are going to have questions about what sort of team comp do they build, what units are useful, who can they take, because obviously everybody's going to have their pick for grand units, but who would work best within their class to buff those units? So first, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that this will be happening on July 16th. Again, that probably should end up being somewhere around next Wednesday. But again, this may be something like Thursday morning or something, depending on the time zone for us. I'd have to look at the actual timing. But either way, we could expect it pretty much like mid part of next week. And we should know that, again, there are at least some hints as to who the Grand Lancer might be. Basically, the current ongoing event in JP is the Lotto event. And in that Lotto event, Indra is featured prominently, and he is supposedly boasting about being Grand Lancer. Now, that does not necessarily mean 100% chance that he will be. This could be a bait and switch type of situation, but I think it's worthy of mentioning this, that, when thinking about the upcoming Grand Lancer duel, that yes, we might in fact be facing someone like Indra. And obviously, with regards to that, he's unknown gender, he's neutral and balanced alignment. His basic traits are Divine Spirit, Divinity, Group Servant, Humanoid, Immune to Pigify, King, Loved One, Non-Hominide, Riding, Servant, Seven Knight Servant, Weak to Enemy Elish, and Levitating in Stage 1. So, again, depending on how we get him, in what form should we get him, and like I said, it could be somebody else, but obviously there's some stuff here to explore, particularly the Divinity one. To me, if they actually choose Indra, his gender being unknown would actually be really bad, because we do have a couple of anti-male Lancers that would certainly love for an actual male to be chosen rather than somebody that's gender unknown. But we definitely can pick some things apart about this, and whether or not we end up with the exact same battle as before will remain to be seen. Indra does have some accompaniment here, so there's always the possibility that this might be our first non-single target fight for the grand duels. We might end up with an AoE battle on our hands, but we'll just have to see how the devs design it. So obviously, with regards to that, just kind of think on the fly when it actually does come out, and try to look at what will best work in those situations. Also, just another PSA, don't forget you can change who your Grand Lancer is. So if you're worried about it a whole lot and you have multiple candidates, go with the one that works best and then switch afterwards, so that way you don't end up kind of giving yourself a hard time necessarily trying to grind some of this out. Remember, the first week there is always free of the requirement of using storm pods, but after that point there is going to be the storm pod requirement. So keep that in mind for those of you guys that are maybe looking to grind this at some point, that you want to grind early rather than late. Okay, now with regards to that, what Lancers would work best in a team composition? There are a ton of Lancers in this game, so who's actually going to be the one to go with is going to depend entirely on who you're taking and who you think could work really well. So right off the bat here, we have Liz. Liz Lancer is obviously known for her sadistic charisma, so if you have a female Grand Lancer or any sort of female allies at play here, she can basically get double the attack up for them. It's definitely a really nice one. She can also reduce the enemy's defense for 3 turns and remove their latest buff, as well as skill sealing them. So depending on how this grand duel works out, we might have some scenarios where, yes, even things like buff removal could come into play. It's definitely an interesting one to see. She has her guts for herself, but there's nothing too much that you should need for something like that. Again, the priority will be clearing quickly and early. We do have a lot of defense ignore on Noble Phantasms within the Lancer class, so don't be surprised to see something like defense pop up on the enemy if it would be a easy way to allow certain units to shine. It really just depends on what they want to do with the unit, but you know, obviously you can set things up where you can fire off multiple noble phantasms at a time and use that to your advantage. BenK is another one here. He's obviously got things like skill seal and NP seal, but logically you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. But you can potentially get yourself into a solo environment with a lot of units in the Lancer class due to the plethora of taunt skills that exist within this this grouping. So again, BenK is going to have a taunt skill that you could use to maybe get like an esports version of him or one of the other ones killed. He also, at least with his NP, has the chance to stun the enemy as well as remove their buffs. Maybe not as good as somebody like Elizabeth that can actually do it on a skill, but it is an option there for you. Same thing in the same vein there. Leonidas is also another really good option for you. He does have the ability that when his guts gets activated, that he can potentially increase the party's attack by 20%. He also has a taunt and then a buster performance increase on his skill for the entire party by 25%. So I'd make note particularly of this third one if you're somebody that's going to be using a buster Grand Lancer, as he's just kind of got a one-off skill that he can press to get a little bit more firepower there. But it really depends on what you think you can get away with. Obviously, his NP will basically just be a crit star bomb for this effect. You could also use it as yet another taunt, but not too much there for the actual party. Hector is another interesting option, as Hector, while he himself is AoE, does at least have a party-wide tactics that can help, and again, get a little bit more NP damage out there for the party. He also does have the ability to drain and potentially stun an enemy, and he can also increase the party's attack now for 3 turns with his new third skill, as well as giving himself a charge and a cleanse. So it is a much improved third skill that if you've done the upgrade for would help you out in these circumstances. And yet again, he is another unit that has defense ignore on his noble phantasm and the ability to reduce their defense after the damage goes out for 3 turns. So he can be used as sort of a setup man where he fires off his NP and you follow it with your more damaging one afterwards. Obviously, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention OG Shisho here. Shisho is a fantastic unit, not only in her own right for boss killing, but also due to the fact that she has in her second skill, Primeval Rune. This is going to charge the target by 20%, as well as increase the quick performance for 1 turn by 50%. So obviously you'd want to use this on someone like her, but if you maybe had a Grand that you were trying to like hyper buff, or you yourself had felt like the need to take a different quick unit, this could certainly work really well for you if you targeted somebody else with it. It's also got the increased buff success rate for 3 turns, though it shouldn't factor in too much for Lancers. And then obviously her third skill here is anti-divine and undead. So if we are facing a divine enemy, of which a lot of Lancers are divine, you're gonna see there is a ton here of extra damage she can do, as it's a 3-turn 100% power mod that'll really work in her own advantage. Her NP as well can stun an enemy for 1 turn, so if you maybe feel like you can't get away with a 1-turn clear, being able to just hard stun the enemy with Shisho certainly can work. And obviously she does have the chance to instant kill, but don't expect that to happen if at all on a long grind session against another servant. That's always been the case, is trying to actually stun a servant can usually, or not stun, death proc a servant can usually be a little bit precarious to try to land. Now next up here, we got my own personal waifu, and that's Lartoria. Lartoria got an amazing upgrade here recently to her second skill. It became Wild Hunt B+. This now increases the party's attack for 3 turns by up to 20%, as well as the party's NP damage for 3 turns by up to 20%. If that weren't enough, if it is a Round Table Knight ally, they also get an additional 30%. Now, obviously, she herself qualifies for that, but there are several other Lancers, including Lalter, Gareth, Melisande, and Percival, that all count as a Round Table Knight. So if you're using one of them, you certainly can boost them even further with Lartoria's charisma skill here. So it's definitely a really solid one. She also has cleanse in her own kit, ignore invincibility, and the ability to refund a little bit of her charge afterwards. Next up here, we've got Kiyohime Lancer. This one, to me, not that good of an option, but hey, if you're maybe just desperate or you want to bond with her some, feel free to go for it. Her third skill here has the reduction to an enemy's defense for 3 turns by 30%. The trade-off here is you better hope that you kill, because you're also increasing the enemy's attack by 20% for 3 turns as a demerit. So be very careful with that. Otherwise, there's nothing too much here that she's going to do for allies in that regard. It's just going to be more of that. She can skill seal with her NP and burn, but otherwise, again, it's pretty much all going to be about that defense down on her. Now, Vlad III is another interesting one, as he is somebody that obviously ends up being a little bit more on the tanky side. He does have a taunt for himself, but his second skill, Dracul Military Tactics A, if you've done the upgrade, has party-wide NP damage for 3 turns of up to 20% and party-wide buster performance for 3 turns of up to 20%. So you can get a little bit more firepower there. And then again, if the enemy actually does end up hitting him, he'll inflict defense down on them. So there is some interesting stuff you can do if you end up in a multi-turn scenario. He does at least have invincibility pierce with his NP, and he does super effective damage against evil alignment enemies. So another thing to make note of. Probably one of the premier buster buffers in this group is going to be Minamoto no Raiko Lancer, aka Mama Raiko Lancer. This is her summer form. She hasn't been back in years in that regard, but be careful because this one's not to be slept on. She does have a cleanse with her second skill that is targetable, as well as having 3 turns of buster up for 40%. So it's really nice in that regard. She also has a party-wide charisma here for 3 turns of 20% while increasing the critical star generation rate for 3 turns. And then naturally, she is a single target NP that not only generates a star bomb when it goes off, but also ignores defense on an enemy. So again, another really nice sort of coherent kit there for just increasing performance of a unit. Parvati herself, while she is an AoE and she may not have the best application in terms of party-wide usages, looking at her third skill, we do at least have one of the rare sort of charge supports and types of skills here in the Lancer class. Lancer class does not have a whole lot of options for getting more charge. Parvati is at least going to be one of them. She can target an ally and give them up to 20% charge. The downside is this comes at a demerit of 10% of her own charge. So just be careful with something like that, but it can be used to confer charge to somebody else. She does also have a chance to sort of charm and refill the party's NP gauge with her NP. So consider that as well if you end up in a multi-turn environment. Ereshkigal is another interesting prospect, as naturally she does at least have the Blessing of Kerr. That's one of those that's going to increase the party's NP gen rate, defense, and max HP. But then when she fires off her NP, anybody that had the buff from her third skill will also get the 20% increase for 3 turns for their attack. So you could use Arish as a little bit of a setup option. Plus, she's much improved in her own damage capacity. So maybe leading off with an Arish NP, followed up by somebody a little bit more single target if we're in a single target environment could be good, or even somebody else AoE if we're in an AoE environment. All of those could be decent options for her with regards to acting as a party buffer. Next up, we have Bradamonte. Bradamonte is actually going to be one you don't want to sleep on, because for once here, she's actually going to be one of the best charge supports that the Lancer class has. Her third skill, Angelica Cathay, has been improved and now has 30% targetable charge, as well as a cleanse effect on it. The other effects of the skill are all her own, but this one's going to be really nice for getting charge on somebody else. And it is one of the strongest ones that we'll have. There's only one other one that really kind of ties it in terms of charge support capability, especially for a one-off charge scenario. Now, her NP does have the ability to potentially stun an enemy, but otherwise, there's not a whole lot going on here for Bradamonte. This is just going to really boil down to, is it an AoE setup or is it a single target? I think a lot of people are expecting it to be single target, just as the old ones have been, but she will naturally be a decent option for you. Nao Kagura, obviously she is single target arts herself, so some of you might be utilizing her as your own grand, but she does at least have a party-wide attack increase and critical damage increase, as well as critical star generation, all for 3 turns, all for 20% on her 3rd skill. So there is some sort of synergy here if you're trying to fire off multiple Noble Phantasms to get the job done. On top of that, her Noble Phantasm can remove all an enemy's offensive buffs, so if you're worried about maybe particularly annoying ones in a scenario like that, that could be really good, as well as reducing the enemy's crit chance should the enemy get to take a turn. Next up here we have Gareth, and while Gareth herself really doesn't have a whole lot to offer for the party, she does at least manage to have a taunt skill just like several of the other units, so this may be a decent option if you're trying to get into a little bit more of a solo environment. You can set her up with something like, I don't know, like Battle of Camlan or something, and try to get party charge onto somebody else by getting her killed. But this is probably more of a like, hey, I'm not going to be able to one-shot type of strategy. So it is what it is. She does at least have invincibility pierce with her NP, and her NP can apply defense down after the damage goes out for 3 turns of 10%. So it's not the strongest defense down, but it could be used as a little bit of a setup option. Mysterious alter ego Lambda is a little bit of a weird one. We do have some units out there like Debrinia Lancer, who's a little bit newer to the class, that can take advantage of water side effects. So having somebody that can change the battlefield to water side like Lambda could be a decent option. Now, a lot of people are probably going to focus on Lambda's 3rd skill here, which is her massive attack increase. That also is a massive charge skill for her, as it will charge her up to 30% per ally drained. The problem with this skill is going to be that it does rob your allies of their charge, so it's definitely something to make note of if you find yourself in a situation to use her, but be careful that you don't drain yourself out of having charge on an ally for their NP. Besides that, her NP would at least have a niche use in the fact that if you're on the water side battlefield, it will remove any evasion buff that the enemy has on. So that could be useful depending on the scenario that we're up against. She also does defense ignoring damage and critical star bomb on that NP. Next up here, we've got Usumi Arish, and she doesn't really have a whole lot going for her in the party capacity, but she's another one that can deal damage and remove defensive buffs. So unfortunately, the damage is going to go out first before she removes defensive buffs, but this could be used as another setup option for somebody else. I would tell you it's probably better to get this sort of utility off of a skill rather than a Noble Phantasm in that case, since this is coming after the damage output rather than before, but it's something to make note of in case people are restricted in terms of their options. Now, Consort U Lancer is another interesting one, as her 2nd skill has the ability to charge an ally's NP gauge by 20%. It's also a taunt for her. The issue with Consort U is primarily going to be that her Noble Phantasm, while it is single target quick, deals extra damage to male enemies. So if it does end up being Indra like we're maybe foreseeing here, we would be in a little bit of a weird spot, because obviously Indra is not classified as male, at least for right now. Maybe they could change something with the fight and make that the case, but at least as it appears, Indra is unknown gender, so that would not trigger this extra super effective male damage. She can inflict curse and burn to an enemy, but again, unless that's set up for somebody else, it's not really too much of a big deal. Vitra is another one you guys really don't want to sleep on, particularly because an entire swath of the Lancer class is categorized as having divinity. And so there are a ton of possibilities, including Indra himself, that actually would fall under Vitra's 2nd skill effect, which basically increases the entire party's anti-divine damage for 3 turns by 30%. So it's a really, really nice party-wide power mod that if we're up against the divine enemy, Vitra can be used quite effectively. So there's a whole lot you could manage to do here. She obviously has a lot of self-charge, and she does, at least on her third skill, have the ability to increase the party's NP damage for one time over 5 turns by up to 20%. So there's at least some decent effects here for the party should you find yourself in a situation to be able to use them. Her Noble Phantasm can seal the skills of her enemies, as well as reduce their critical attack chance and their arts card resistance. So she could be a good buffer and a good setup person if we're using other arts units in the party. Next up here, we've got Percival. Percival himself, not going to have that much going for him, but he does at least increase the party's NP damage for 3 turns by 20% with his first skill. So yet another sort of setup unit, if you can understand that. He also does have some decent options should the situation call for it, by having a taunt, as well as having a targetable invincibility and heal. So if the situation starts to fall apart, Percival would not be a bad person to either have in your backline or just in your party in general. He can ignore invincibility with his NP, as well as recover the health of the lowest HP ally by 3,000. And again, I think he could be a decent option defensively should the situation call for it. Sakamoto Riyoma, definitely not the strongest here, but he does at least have some much improved capability due to his buffs, and his first skill is a party-wide arts increase, critical damage increase, and then overcharges the party's MP by 1 stage for 1 time 3 turns. So we do have quite a bit of capability off of that first skill. Again, he ends up having 50% charge himself, so he does have the capacity to at least get to an NP easily. You wouldn't need a whole lot of charge support for someone like him, or even necessarily have to take something like a K-Scope. And his NP does increase his own defense and NP generation rate, as well as draining all enemies' gauges by 1 guaranteeably. So depending on the situation that we're in, if it's in a more longer form type of environment, he could be somebody that could be really useful. Next up, we have Mary Anning. Mary Anning is just a 1-star, but she actually has quite a bit of supportive capability. Her first skill here increases the attack, arts card performance, and NP generation rate of female or unknown gender allies by basically 15% for both the attack and the arts up. Definitely a really strong skill there. She has a critical star bomb of up to 30 stars on her second skill, and still has a party-wide charge of 10%, with party-wide critical damage going up to 30% on her third skill. So a whole lot of capability there, and that's not to mention the drain effect that that skill has, as well as her ability to inflict buff block to an enemy. So naturally, we've got a whole lot of capability here. She's not going to be someone that's going to be known for her damage output, but she's a fantastic buffer and setup unit for a 1-star option. And then probably our best charge support for the Lancers is going to end up being Don Quixote. Don Quixote's third skill, while it does confer him the super large niche of up to 30% power mod for 3 turns, also allows him to transfer his charge to his party members, and it can only be used when he has 30% charge or higher, and it will basically end up conferring 30% charge to those party members. So it's really solid just for that alone, on top of it being a 30-star star bomb. So Don Quixote is going to be probably the premier charge support for the Lancer class, and definitely a really solid one at getting everybody else up and ready. He is a single target quick unit, but I think his niches being super large and giant, probably not likely to run into those. But he does, on the back end of his MP, have an increase to the party's attack by 20% for 3 turns. So if you can, in that time, manage to get him to an NP, you'll get the benefit of that, as well as an increase to the party's critical damage for 3 turns by 20%. So Don Quixote is just an all-around monster for support purposes, given the fact that we are stuck using Lancers only. Breedomart herself doesn't really have a whole lot going for her. She, however, is going to be somebody that could be used as another setup option. She does have quick and buster resist down on the back end of her NP that scales with overcharge. It's base 10%, so it's not terribly strong. but I felt like I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't mention it. She also does increase damage against writing traded enemies, of which Indra does have. So should that situation call for it, she may be sort of a like pocket pick there that actually could end up having some niche uses. Beimma himself, altogether pretty selfish unit, but he does manage to end up, while being single target buster, have the ability to remove one enemy's buffs before his damage goes out. So Beimma could definitely be a good unit to lead if we're dealing with some pesky buffs that the enemy has, or just the hard carry should we need to get rid of it in time to do enough damage. Next up here, we have Debrinia, and while, again, Debrinia is more of a selfish unit herself, we did mention earlier she does get some additional nice effects if she's on a water side battlefield, so a good pair up with Alter Ego Melt, but also ending up having the ability to seal an enemy's NP, and after damage goes out, reduce their arts resistance by 20% for 3 turns. So you do have some capability to at least kind of set things up for another arts unit that's maybe doing the carry. Vango Miner is another interesting and new one not to be slept on. She's a welfare, so a lot of you guys should have her. Her first skill actually manages to have the capability that when you have 10 critical stars or more, can choose to increase one of the stats of the party by 20%. It will naturally increase the party's NP gen rate, but you can choose to either do quick arts or buster buffing for 3 turns by 20%, so definitely another nice option there. The rest of her kit, a little bit more selfish in that regard. It's a little bit more city battlefield oriented and crit damage oriented, but hey, if you wanted to set it up, you could probably do some pretty insane crit damage with Vango Miner. Her Noble Phantasm is AoE, it does have a chance to stun, and it does set up the city battlefield on the node in particular, but other than that, nothing too much to write home about. And again, King Ashoka is going to be another interesting one who's a little bit newer, as his first skill, while he is an AoE Lancer, does have the ability to increase the party's arts, buster, and NP damage for 3 turns each by 20%. So basically a 40% steroid to anybody that's arts or buster, definitely a nice pairing. His Noble Phantasm is also going to have the ability to increase damage against a demonic enemy, as well as enemies that are evil alignment, and it will reduce the enemy's defense for 3 turns by base 20%, so yet another decent setup option. Same thing with Enkidu. Enkidu actually is going to be some people's Grand Lancer carry. He does have 50%. He does have the ability to remove enemies' defense buffs, and he does also manage to end up having on the back of his MP a defense down. So you could also use Enkidu as a little bit of another setup person if Enkidu is not your Grand Lancer choice. And then last but not least is obviously Indra. Now, Indra himself is a pretty selfish unit all around, but Indra does, at least on his NP, have the AoE ability to remove all enemies debuffs, or sorry, all enemies buffs. So there is at least some potential should we end up in an NP fight with some pesky buffs on where someone like Indra could be useful. That's it. That's pretty much all the Lancers that I can come up with who would be effective for you guys to use in these scenarios. Naturally, I'm not talking about who to pick for your Grand, so feel free to find a pairing that works for you, but let me know in the comments below what composition you'll be using, how you'll be getting the charge on your favorite Grand Lancer, and of course, who will be your Grand Lancer choice. I'll be curious to hear you guys' thoughts. I will see you guys for the next one. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one. I exist as a figment of your imagination. I'm only there when you don't look.